For the final half-century of British rule, India's per capita economic growth averaged a near stagnant 0.5% per year. Then, starting in 1947, the newly independent nation achieved a sudden upward break, averaging 4.1% annual growth over the next 18 years. This growth had to overcome a deeply hollowed-out baseline. British commercial policy had systematically displaced India's traditional textile base with tariff-protected imports from Lancashire mills, leaving the subcontinent with almost no modern domestic capital goods manufacturing. The agrarian reality was equally bleak. Decades of fragmented landholdings left agricultural productivity completely stagnant, with cultivators relying on wooden hand plows and physical labor. On top of this fragile inheritance came the historic shock of the 1947 partition. The borders abruptly severed integrated economic zones, separating Punjab's wheat fields from their irrigation networks and cutting off Bengal's raw jute supply from its processing mills in Calcutta. The geographic division displaced up to 18 million people. The immediate physical cost of resettling these refugees and dividing the colonial administrative and military assets drained the new state's treasury. The starting line for modern Indian economic history was an economy suffering from absolute systemic stasis, layered with acute demographic and geographic trauma. Faced with this reality, India's political leadership debated exactly how to construct economic sovereignty from scratch. Mahatma Gandhi argued for a decentralized, village-centered economy. He prioritized labor-intensive cottage industries, believing that mass employment and self-reliance in rural communities were more critical than capital-intensive machinery. Jawaharlal Nehru, heavily influenced by Fabian socialism and Soviet planning, argued that the state needed to command the heights of heavy industry. In his view, true sovereignty required a domestically owned capital goods sector. If India could not manufacture its own steel and machine tools, it would remain permanently dependent on foreign imports and neo-colonial trade networks. The political debate resolved decisively in Nehru's favor. While cottage industries were kept as a subordinate, protected sector, the strategic priority shifted toward urbanized, state-directed heavy industrialization. The state committed its developmental future to a highly specific mathematical framework that would strictly dictate the allocation of every available resource. The architect of this strategy was the statistician Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis. For the second five-year plan, he designed a two-sector mathematical model that divided all national investment into Sector C, producing consumer goods, and Sector K, producing capital goods. If planners allocated the bulk of investment to Sector C, things like textiles and food, the economy would see a fast increase in immediately consumable output. However, the underlying capacity to produce more goods remains completely static. By directing investment into Sector K, heavy machinery and steel, the state starves the immediate consumer market. But those capital goods loop back into the system, expanding the economy's base capacity to produce exponentially more goods in all subsequent cycles. The mathematical conclusion was clear. India had to deliberately sacrifice short-term consumption to elevate the country onto a structurally higher, compounding growth trajectory over the long run. During the first and second plans, this logic translated into massive physical infrastructure. The state poured capital into immense, multi-purpose river valley projects, building some of the world's highest gravity dams to combine irrigation, flood control, and hydroelectric power. Running these massive physical assets required domestic expertise. The government simultaneously financed an elite tier of scientific infrastructure, establishing the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Department of Atomic Energy to generate the necessary engineering and management cadres. The Mahalanobis model offered a flawless mathematical proof that prioritizing long-term capital accumulation was the correct path, assuming the state could execute it perfectly in the real world. Executing this model in a capital-starved economy required an aggressive administrative apparatus. The state codified a mixed economy through industrial policy resolutions, reserving strategic industries exclusively for government ownership. To shield these nascent industries from international competition, planners implemented import substitution industrialization, using high tariff walls and quantitative licensing to protect the domestic market. Because the heavy industry projects required expensive foreign machinery, the central bank strictly rationed foreign exchange. All available hard currency was routed into Sector K imports, actively starving the consumer sector of the equipment it needed to modernize. Internally, the Industries Act enforced this allocation by legally requiring private firms to obtain government licenses just to expand their own production capacity. Planners believed private capital was too risk-averse to build long-gestation assets like steel plants. To support them, the government built a new financial scaffolding, creating development financial institutions to route long-term credit toward approved projects. Making the math work required building a restrictive wall around the Indian economy, allowing bureaucrats to dictate exactly what could be imported, built, and consumed. By the second five-year plan, this forced capital allocation successfully yielded 3 massive state-owned integrated steel plants, constructed in partnership with foreign governments. This table compares the planned targets against actual GDP growth. While the first plan exceeded its modest goal, the third plan suffered a sharp shortfall, achieving only 2.8% against a 5.6% target. The sheer volume of machinery imports required for heavy industry drained the country's reserves. This triggered a severe balance of payments crisis by 1957, forcing India into a sustained reliance on external aid financing and IMF standby assistance. When we look at the sectoral composition of the national economy over this 18-year period, we see a stark disconnect. Despite the intense fiscal concentration on heavy industry, industry's share national income only expanded from 15 to 22%. Agriculture remained the dominant sector, declining modestly to 44% of output, while continuing to absorb over 70% of the workforce. The state successfully poured its treasury into industrial installations, but the vast majority of the population remained operating in an underfunded, stagnant agricultural reality. To understand why that 4.1% average growth failed to transform the broader economy, economists ask a specific question. Was the growth driven by simple accumulation or by genuine efficiency? The Solo-Swan framework divides growth into 2 sources: perspiration, adding inputs, and inspiration, efficiency. India's growth was driven by perspiration, brute-forcing output through massive capital investment. Meanwhile, total factor productivity remained flat. Shielded by tariffs, domestic manufacturers had no incentive to upgrade efficiency. The system designed to protect infant industries rigidified into a bureaucratic apparatus termed the license permit Raj. Complex licensing rules restricted domestic competition, protecting high-cost, inefficient producers and generating widespread rent-seeking. An investment-driven model lacking productivity gains is mathematically subject to diminishing returns. Once the state exhausts the initial infrastructure projects, the growth rate stalls. In the 1960s, external military shocks shattered the math of the third plan. The 1962 and 1965 wars forced a massive diversion of fiscal resources away from civilian industrialization and directly into defense spending. Simultaneously, the ideological obsession with Sector K had starved agricultural research and land reform of capital. Planners had prioritized steel mills over high-yielding seeds and rural irrigation networks. This structural vulnerability collapsed during the consecutive monsoon failures of 1965 and 1966. Food grain output dropped by 17%, creating an immediate, catastrophic shortage. A heavy industry model designed specifically to guarantee national self-reliance resulted in absolute dependence. India had to rely on millions of tons of emergency wheat shipments from the United States just to avert mass famine, reducing the country to a precarious ship-to-mouth existence. War, drought, and a drained treasury forced the government to completely abandon 5-year planning for 3 years, entering a hiatus known as the Plan Holiday. The Mahalanobis gamble successfully broke colonial stagnation and established the physical infrastructure of a modern state. But by treating a deeply impoverished, agrarian economy as a rigid mathematical equation, it engineered an uncompetitive industrial sector and left the food supply exposed, locking the economy into a structural stagnation that would persist for decades.